Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 8th webinar in our series. I'm Robert Thompson, Principal Architect here at Aki Workshop, where we focused on responsible hillside living with an aim to improve the culture around design and architecture in the broader Caribbean. Today, I'm joined by Shae Diaz, architectural designer here at Aki Workshop, to talk about the hidden costs of construction. Shae will be taking you through a presentation he's prepared and taking your questions at the end. Enjoy.
That introduction. Good evening, everyone. Let's get right into it. So, the hidden cost of construction. For some background, in this stage of the design process, the construction stage, we have already created the construction drawings, drafted up the initial cost proposals for the building project, and now we started the actual physical building. So when we say hidden cost, we have hidden in quotation marks because when you work with a professional, none of the costs are hidden, but rather sometimes you may forget that there are both monetary and intangible costs to construction. And we sometimes forget to factor that into reviewing the cost, the overall cost of the project. The construction industry as a whole is a variable one. Construction costs differ based on the economy, the contractors we choose, the consultants, and the magnitude of the fees never really stay the same. As a result, there will always be some degree of error when we compare the initial cost to the final cost estimate. So how do we calculate these costs? There are two ways that we're going to focus on today. We'll start with the square footage estimate. And there are two types of square footage estimate. There's an overall square footage estimate, where we take the total square footage of the design and multiply it by a per square foot cost. So for example, the building we'll be using today is a single family residence that is 2,500 square feet. And the usual rate for a residential structure on flat land is between 750 to 800 TT dollars per square foot. So for the example that we're going to use, the 3-bedroom residential house at 2,500 square feet, we would estimate that it would come up to 2 million TT approximately. Now, the per square foot cost differs between a hillside house and a house on flat land. So the per square footage cost for a hillside house is 1,200 TT per square foot. And you'd see that for the same house, the cost goes up exponentially at 3 million for the total estimate.
Yes. Shae, can I just jump in for a second? So with the hillside cost, that's just a safe estimate. So usually you would look at a range between 1,200 to 1,500, but 1,200 is a safe sort of area to kind of look at your budget when you're thinking about it, depending on how big and your finishes and so on. Sorry, Shae.
Right. No problem. That's a really good point. It really does vary from site to site. So in order to get a more refined estimate, we use another form of square footage cost. And this cost is calculated by a room-by-room basis. So in this method, instead of using the overall square footage, we look at the room schedule and the types of rooms that the structure would have, and we apply a factor, or we multiply it by a factor to get a true understanding of how much square footage would it take. For example, a garage would take much less finishes than a living room, but might be a larger size. So for this example, we still use the 2,500 square foot house. If you got it, Robert.
on now? Yeah.
Sorry.
Robert, you had something to add?
Oh yeah, sorry. No, I was gonna say the factor determines your factor is determined by the level of finish that you expect in a space.
Yes.
So let's say you have a living room that's above 10 feet. Your factor might be a bit larger than if you're at a standard height. And that's where the square footage costs tend to give you a degree more accuracy than just flat square foot cost. Sorry, Shae.
No problem. So in this example, we are using the same 3-bedroom, 2,500 square foot house, but you would notice that we apply different factors to different rooms. As Robert mentioned, the living room, for example, has a factor of 1.5 in that living room might have a 10-foot ceiling. It would definitely have more finishes than the garage, for example, which has a lower factor. And using this example, we see that we get a total estimated cost of 1,996,000, as opposed to the 2 million estimates that we got from the overall square footage cost. Now we have a case study using the same 3-bedroom house, and we will see how this initial cost estimate compares to the refined cost estimate that we'll get later on.
Because it's a progression from a rough estimate, and then you get granular as you go, as you get more defined, as your needs get more defined.
Yes, definitely.
Excellent.
And speaking of that, we have the other estimate that we will receive after the initial estimate. We'd get something called the builder's estimate, which is a bill of quantities that is measured and priced by the contractor. Now, at this stage, the contractor would already have the definite quotations for the consultants and for the pricing of the materials. So he would have a better understanding of the real world cost that would take place for this project. And as Robert said, there is a transition between the initial bill of quantities, which would be created by a quantity surveyor using more generic pricing, compared to the contractor who would have the defined prices. And with that builder's estimate, we'd have a better reflection of the real world cost of that this project would have.
Something else I would add is with having the quantity surveyor prepare bill of quantities, you would have somebody that's taking care of your interest do an initial pricing so that you could have something to compare when the builder's estimate comes back. And that's always important to understand. Plus, the quantity surveyor would assess that builder's estimate for you to make sure that it's fair.
Yes, definitely. And using that same point, we have an example of an initial bill of quantities. And I would like to draw your attention to this bill of quantities estimate the price of all the major components that we need for the construction of this house, the walls, the slabs, the finishes. But it's more of an estimation. And in this example, you would see that some of the values are missing. These are the values for the MEP engineer, that is the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineer. And sometimes this might happen where you can't accurately reflect the prices yet. You might have a MEP engineer that you're working with, but he's not available, so you'd have to try and get a new estimate. And the quantity surveyor would take that into account and have contingencies in place to try and get the most accurate reflection of the total cost as possible. So in this example, we see that the estimate is 1,760,000. And the next example we have is the builder's estimate. This is a more refined version of the bill of quantities, and we see that it actually came up to 1,995,000. So with this presentation, we'll explain where that additional 230,000 came from. so
Yeah.
that when you create your own, when you partake in your own construction, that jump in price won't be a surprise to you.
Another thing I'd like to add as well, Shae, if you go back to the last slide, is that more in some cases, the earlier in the process, your contingency percentage might be bigger to cover for those unknown items. So that's something to keep in mind.
So, as I said, we'll be going through this example of the builder's estimate throughout the presentation so you can understand the different components and the different cost distributions based on what kind of materials or services that we had purchased. Okay, so now we're going into the two different types of costs that we deal with, the hard costs versus the soft costs. And the hard costs are the tangible physical items that you could see. For example, there'll be the rental of equipment, the materials, the labor, the site management. And these are things, most of them are things that you could see with your eyes and physically hold and say, I bought this. And that's what makes it a hard cost. Now, going back to example, we see that a large percentage of our total cost comes from the structural elements. Those are the floor slabs, the foundation, especially the walls. That would come up to approximately 30% of your total cost in this example. It might be more based on your project. Another hard cost we look at is the finishes, and this also takes up a large percent of the budget. This is approximately 20%. So you see with the structure and the finishes alone, that's basically half your budget already. Some other hard costs will be the installation done by the MEP. So we would see electrical installation, air conditioning, plumbing. That also takes up another 10%. And then we have smaller costs like the cost of the doors and windows, the carpentry for the cupboards for the living room and the kitchen, and smaller metalwork. But also included in the hard costs are the external works. So when you have to pay for work to be done for your driveway, for any planters, stuff like that, stuff done outside of the house but within the site. It's also considered a hard cost.
Shae, another big cost that a lot of people don't think about is your boundary wall as well. As an external cost, that's usually very, very high.
Yes, especially on a hillside.
On a hillside.
Right, and the final hard cost we're gonna look at is the site management cost that the contractor would give you. So we spoke about hard costs. Let's go to soft costs now. And these are the intangible costs related to construction. For example, the contractor's preliminary costs, the cost of consultants, the cost of insurance, legal fees, and obtaining approvals. And with this presentation, we will focus on obtaining approvals because that is the lesser known of these soft costs. So there are different aspects of obtaining approvals that we need to get. So the first one we'd have to get is the approval of the building plans. So we have the plans drawn up, but they still need to be approved. After they're approved, we get a building permit that allows us to start construction. And while after construction, we would also need certification for utilities, that's setting up water, setting up electricity, and making sure you're protected against fire. And then finally, after we have all those approvals, we get the certificate of completion to know that your structure is finished. So let's dig into these approvals, and you'd see examples of the actual TT dollar price that it would take to get these approvals. So starting with town and country planning, the outline approval, the outline planning permission and the planning approval is free, fortunately. But after that, we have the approval of the drawing plans, and that for a single family residence is 300 per building units. And we would continue our example with the 3-bedroom, 2,500 square foot house that we have. And you'd see the total cost and a running total at the bottom. So you'd know how much in approval costs we'd have a day. And you'd also notice that the cost changes when you have a multiple family residence, when you have a business, a commercial space, it differs. You also have to pay for the approval of the lot. And the more lots you have, the higher the cost will be. All right, so we're on to obtaining a building permit. And you'd notice that there's a large variation for this one, especially. This cost of obtaining a building permit differs from location to location. So based on your regional corporation, costs will be different. So it ranges from $150 to $500 to get this approval. And that's only for a single family home. For a multiple resident home, it'll be much higher. And the more stories you have, the higher it would be. So for example, we took the average, and that's the amount that we'll be calculating for our example. And then after which,
Sorry,
go
Shae,
ahead.
one little additional thing as well. If you start building before receiving a building permit, there's also a fee, a penalty. I'm not quite sure what the number is, but just keep that in mind as well.
Yes, for sure. So we finally have the completion certificate, and this too varies from location to location. So right now our running total is 1,100 just for approvals alone. So if you would like running water, it's additional cost. You pay to WASA, the Water and Sewerage Authority. And if you want electricity, that's another additional cost. It'll be $95 per meter, and you'd have to pay for inspections. So you'd have to pay for a primary inspection. Well, for example, they'll do a pipe and wall inspection, which would be $40, a trench inspection, $30, a ceiling inspection, and then you'd have to get another inspection, which is your final inspection, which would be $3 per point. Now, a point would be a point of access for electricity, so that'll be your outlet, your light, and stuff like that. And how much of those you have may be 40 to 100. You have to pay $3 for each for the inspection alone. So for example, the house that we're dealing with, the three bedroom, 2,500 square foot, it'll be 110 for the initial inspection. If you have 60 points, the final inspection will cost 180. And that would all come up to 385 for the total cost of inspection. And when you get a certificate of approval, it's free, fortunately. So our running total is $2,212.50 for approval so far. Now, this is the final approval that we'll be dealing with. This is a fire inspection. So you'd get a certificate of is fireproofed. And you see the cost for inspection, initial and final, for this one is a lot higher. But fortunately, you only really need to do this inspection if the land that you plan to build on doesn't have any roads or bridges. So they would have to be constructed, and this is where this cost would come into play. So if you do need fire approval, your total is now $2,622.50. And that's it for approvals. So another majorly important part of all these cost calculations is the contingency. Now, the contingency fee is a cost that is recommended by the architect or the contractor, but to the client, which the client holds for emergencies. Is a cost calculated as a percentage of the overall budget. And what it does is it protects the client from unforeseen expenses. So it acts as a buffer. For example, with recent weather conditions, now we see that we have consecutive days of rain, which would cause major timeline delays. And the longer the timeline is delayed, the more money that the client would have to pay. So this contingency really acts to protect the client from that additional cost.
Yeah. Can
The,
I
yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
give
Sure,
you
no
a real
problem.
world example?
Of
So
course.
let's say you're building your house and you're renting, and the contractor said they're gonna take 6 months. But if it's raining, 3 months of the six, now you might have an additional 3 months you need to work. You need to give them an extension of time. So that's 3 more months of rent you have to pay. So that's, where your contingencies will come into play to kind of help you stay out of trouble. So
Yes. Yes, and this all goes back to the variable nature of construction itself, the act of construction. It really depends on a lot of factors, and the contingency helps alleviate a lot of that stress to think about the monetary cost of whatever delays that we have. And using our example, we could see that the contingency that we have is approximately 10% of the overall project cost. Okay, so with all these numbers and all these scenarios, you might be wondering, is it worth it to hire a general contractor or should I just build for myself? And there are certain things you need to keep in mind when making this decision. So we go through them, we go through the management. So the general contractor would most likely be a business. So he would have to manage, he or she, they would have to manage themselves and their team, while with self-building, the management is totally on the client. With payments, the general contractor would have a timeline and would be paid on a per phase basis. Robert, would you also explain the float that the contractor could have?
sure. So depending on the size of the contractor could fund the project depending on their finances. So, you'll probably give a contractor advance payment, and then they won't likely come back to you to say, oh, the money has run out, because they should have accounts to cover the project up to the next billing phase. So that's a benefit to having a contractor, because then is more your cash flow is more steady. Whereas with self-building, your cash flow could be steady, but you could get fluctuation in amounts. Whereas with a general contractor, the amount might not fluctuate payment to payment. It might be a larger sort of settlement at the end if there's unforeseen things that happen, but that's usually negotiable.
Yes. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it possible for you to request the general contractor's account, especially if the project is bigger, just to make
Yes.
sure that they are able to handle those costs?
Yes, definitely. So when you send a tender out, to evaluate certain tenders, you'd probably ask a contractor to provide their financials of their business, so you could actually see that they're able to, you don't want a contractor to take your money to go build someone else's job, right? So you need to know that you need to know how many jobs they have running and how much money they have, so that they could cover your project. But then again, this is when you're dealing with larger projects. A smaller residential project, you might not get that facility, but again, it depends on the size contract you go with.
Yes, definitely. So the general contractor would pay from phase to phase, while with self-building, you might pay workers monthly, fortnightly, or weekly. It really does vary based on the preferences of the client. For this is a very large thing to consider when deciding whether to use a general contractor or self-building is their accountability. So general contractors are governed by professional codes of conduct, and they hold a lot of reliability when it comes to building projects. So they would be they would acquire a lot of risk if they weren't accountable for your project. They also would be liable legally for any shortcomings that may come across. Whereas if you do self-building, the majority of that risk is placed on the client.
Yeah.
And that really does harm our next hidden cost, which is the emotional cost of construction. So that's one thing that we don't really consider, especially when looking at prices, is that if the project goes on longer, that's a weight on you, the client, because it would strain your finances, yes, but your relationships. If you'd have to rent a smaller space with your spouse for a longer period of time, it might cause problems. So that emotional cost of construction should really be factored whenever you think of price. And then
Yeah.
finally, time management. So as I said before, the general contractor creates a timeline and has to stick with it for each phase. And he could request more time, but it would have to be signed off by the client and would have more professional practice that would come along with it. Whereas self-building is less formal. You'd have less formal time estimates and you may not stick to those times, which would cost more money.
And another important thing is that you, the client, will need to manage that time.
Yes.
Because let's say another example is you're ready for a tiler, but you keep calling your tiler and he doesn't come today, doesn't come tomorrow. Those days are adding up to massive delays. Every time delay accumulates. So if you're the one that's doing the managing of the labor, then it's a huge cost on you.
All right. And the final hidden quote unquote cost that we'll be talking about today is the environmental cost. So when you have a building project, it's good to remember that whatever you build doesn't affect your site alone, but the wider context. So your neighborhood, your neighbor and your neighborhood could be affected by whatever you construct. For
Especially on the
example,
hillside.
yeah, especially on hillsides. If you change the drainage, for example, on a hillside, you could cause whoever is below you downslope to get flooded out. So it's really good to think about that wider context. Another aspect of the environmental cost is the environmental cost of transport. So for example, you might not go with a local supplier, you might not go with a supplier in your area because the supplier in Toko has cheaper stuff, but that environmental cost of the van transporting your materials from Toko to wherever you live would have a large cost on the environment. And this is compounded, especially when you use foreign services and materials. So you would imagine that the materials would go from their warehouse to the ports, on the plane to our ports, and then to your house. So that is the compounded mass of air pollution that you would have to be responsible for, whether you think about it or not. So it's
Yeah,
something good to consider.
definitely.
All right, and we've come to our conclusion. So just to recap, there are both monetary and intangible costs to construction. And sometimes we forget to factor these into whenever we review our prices, that these are the factors that we think about, especially when thinking about a building project as an investment, something that would have a high upfront cost, but would hopefully last for generations. The cost estimate changes from phase to phase. So the initial cost would be very different to the final cost. And as we said before, it's because with that, when we get the final cost, with that granular evaluation, of course, we'd have a better understanding of the real world cost that we would have to face as the client. The construction industry is variable in nature, and construction costs vary from project to project. So to account for this, we use contingency fees, which will be suggested by the architect to the client, and they act as a buffer to protect the client from any additional cost. employing professionals can help minimize that emotional cost that construction can have because of their accountability and the standards that they have to live by as professionals could help ease that tension. And finally, construction decisions have an environmental effect from your neighbor to your environment as a whole. So if you take anything away from this, just remember that some hidden costs of construction are the cost of approvals, the contingency costs, the emotional costs, and the environmental costs. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, go ahead and answer.
Excellent. Another thing I'd like to add as well, which we didn't cover, just to give people an idea of what consultant costs range could be. So let's say you're using a full set of consultants. You have an architect involved, you have a structural engineer involved, an MEP engineer involved, and a QS. That could be anywhere between 10 to 20% of your construction budget. But look at that as an investment. Look at that as something that's going to save you that emotional cost, and as well as save you that larger contingency and the time. Right? Any other questions from anybody? You can type it in the chat box, or you come off mute. We'll hold it open for 5 minutes or less.
It seems like the webinar was so comprehensive. We have no questions.
It looks that way. It looks that way. Well, if there's no questions, we will wrap up, and we will.
I see someone unmuted their mic.
Oh.
Hi, good night.
Hello.
It was very informative. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There was just one thing you had mentioned with the costs for like Tech WASA, those costs, right? Is that if you're having a contractor, wouldn't those costs, or are those costs additional, or is it factored into when the electrician has to do?
Yeah, that would be yours to pay. When the
That would be.
So the electrician that wouldn't be the electrician's cost unless they add it, again, what you could do is, ask them if that's included in their cost or if that's additional to their cost.
Oh, okay.
Right. So the electrician would go, take your deeds and go get and apply for inspection and so on. And they would either pay it and get reimbursed, or, you pay it.
Okay. But is that so those are something extra in addition to what the contractor his building cost would be? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, that's additional, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So in you setting up your budget, you kind of think about those soft costs. So your budget is made up of the hard and the soft costs, as we described. Right, so the contractor comes up with the hard costs, and those soft costs are for you to have in mind to make up your total budget.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else with a question? Nope. Well, we'll post this information on YouTube if you ever want to watch it again, and we will send you guys an email out with this presentation as well if you ever want to review it again. And feel free to give us a call if you have any additional queries regarding this or anything else. We're always, we have our, sorry?
No, go ahead.
Sorry. We have our free virtual consultation that we do. Just if you have any further questions, you could book a session with us, and we could talk about any queries you have regarding building or designing your home. All right, so I want to thank everybody for coming to this one, and look out for our next one, where we'll be talking about finishes and how that process is undertaken.
Yes,
Right.
especially relevant for the Christmas season.
Especially relevant for the Christmas season. Everybody's sprucing up relevant places. All right, thank you guys, and see you next time.